before proceeding to the Chicago Group's activities, I would like to say something sweeping about Surrealism's ecological tendencies as I perceive them. And scholarship has not been all that attentive to Surrealism's relationship with nature. But in a recent book chapter, art historian Donna Roberts draws attention to the fact that Surrealism has an innate ecological disposition. And this is especially so, I would argue, if we consider ecology to be something much more broadly encompassing than the scientific study of environments or environmental activism, which is what we may associate ecology with primarily. So while Surrealism has proven to be receptive to both of these manifestations of ecology, biology and activism, its ecological tendencies also include its foundational criticism of anthropocentrism, its linking up of imagination and environment, and its ensuing envisioning of new marvelous interconnections between humans and their surroundings. Surrealism evinces a long-standing fascination for the entirety of nature, including animals, plants, minerals, and the environments in which these exist. Max Ernst collages and Max Ernst collages and paintings, Louis Buñuel's films, Leonora Carrington's paintings and writings, Toyen's paintings, Ricky de Corneille's novels and drawings, and Jan Schwankmayer's films and collages are just some examples that can be mentioned of surrealist works that display new relations between organisms and their surroundings, or which explode naturalistic views of nature with ripples of desire and imagination that incite marvelous transformations. And taken together, these kinds of imageries convey a world in which humans are entangled with the environment, or in which other organisms, even presumably inert matter, display imagination and creativity. So while surrealist imagery shows a fascination for nature from the movement's very beginning, Surrealism's theoretical articulations of ecological stances have become more pronounced throughout the movement's long history. It was largely implicit during its first 15 years or so, took a more pronounced shape during World War II, and was explicitly articulated in a variety of ways in the decades following the war. From the beginning, the movement's belief in the egalitarian qualities of the unconscious destabilized ideological views of the coherent self and its mastery of itself as well as its surroundings. Effie Rentzow describes, for instance, how in the 1930s the surrealist journal Minotaur constantly blurred the boundaries between humans and animals, culture and nature. Later surrealist texts explicitly point to anthropocentrism as one of the central problems afflicting this civilization. In his 1942 Prolegomena to a Third Surrealist Manifesto or Not, published in the wartime journal Triple B, and Breton exclaims, "Man is perhaps not the center, the cynosure of the universe," and he suggests that we need new myths of the world to displace humanity from its self-imposed position as the crown of creation. Following the war, Breton came to diagnose the dire political situation and its threat of destroying the world as a consequence of a fractured human relation with nature. In an interview, he states that surrealists, quote, "in no way accept that nature is hostile to man, but suppose that man, who originally possessed certain keys that kept him in strict communion with nature, has lost these keys, and that since then he persists more and more feverishly in trying out others that don't fit," end quote. For Breton, scientific knowledge about nature was not sufficient to re-establish these severed connections. Instead, he turned to alchemy and occultism for new ways of imagining the constitution of nature. Occultism's analogical thinking and the reconciliation of internal desire and external world, effected by the surrealist marvelous, henceforth became associated with an ecological potential to conjure up the interconnectedness of human and world. But such creative and re-enchanting apprehensions of nature are far from exclusively human abilities. In his 1945 book-length essay, Arcanum 17, Breton writes, "At the top of the list of initial errors that remain the most detrimental stands the idea that the universe only has intelligible meaning for mankind, and that it has none, for instance, for animals. If animals, and even other beings and things, have the capacity to detect a deeper meaning in the universe, then the book of nature is written in a universal language that is constantly read by bacteria, agate stones, and ibises, for instance, as well as by humans attuned to surrealism's eco-occultist hermeneutics." In the decades to follow, Other surrealists made more explicit and direct connections between surrealism's revolutionary subversion of the edifices of Western civilization and the liberation of animals and nature from the stranglehold of human exploitation. The Chicago Surrealists have, as far as I know, taken these tendencies the farthest, and they have done so with equal attention to the marvelous and to the necessity for action. Indeed, their ecological sensibilities are predicated on the dialectics of activism and imagination. In an early collected tract, Thesis on Vision, X-Ray and Otherwise from 1966, the Chicago Surrealists write, "The forest is deep and the night is long, but now we know the wolves are on our side." The tract argues that even the most advanced scientific perception only gives us a partial view of reality, of a reality that is much richer than rationalist ideology leads us to believe. On their journey through the night towards surrealist vision and X-ray vision squared, the group takes comfort in being aided by wolves. The text remained unpublished at the time, but it speaks forcefully to the group's tendency to not just perceive the need to protect animals and the environment, but to imagine new possibilities of forging interspecies alliances. And in particular, it's telling that they are seeking out a revolutionary partnership with a wolf, an animal that, of course, has long been maligned as an enemy of civilization and its keeping of farm animals. Turning the ingrained symbolism of wolves as malicious on its head, the group proposes a human-wolf revolt against a sort of repressive circumstances that reify the lives of both species. As implied already in this short statement, the Chicago Surrealists early on recognized that Surrealism's radical concept of liberty needed to be extended to non-human animals and even to the non-human world in its entirety. And this became more pronounced in the 1971 leaflet, The Anti-Use Umbrella, a contribution to the critique of the ideology of zoos, which Abigail mentioned before, and which was initiated by Penelope Rosemont, handed out to passers-by close to Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. The leaflet is a fierce statement against the captivity of animals in zoos. In the zoo, the leaflet proclaims animals are brought against their will into a penitentiary of the instincts, lashing out against the scientific will to hold animals to hold the animal world in captivity. The tract describes how, quote, the hypnotic fascination, end quote, exerted by the zoo ultimately allows humans, quote, to see their own instincts caged and sterilized, end quote. The zoo, then, is a showcase for all that was once wild but is now displayed in a safe and neutralized form. And the diagnosis is bleak. Humanity's repression of its own instincts and attendant oppression of animals is so deep-seated that the, quote, revolutionary transformation of the relationship between humankind and beasts is all but unthinkable today, end quote. And the tract has an epigraph from the utopian socialist visionary Charles Fourier, which asserts the possibility of drastically different relations between humans and other species. The ostrich, the deer, the gerbil, etc. will come and join forces with man as soon as its company becomes attracted to them, which it can never be in the civilized order. But surrealism and its tradition promises hope. As a way out of this brutal impasse, the Chicago Surrealists call on myths and fairy tales to narrate other forms of human-animal relationships contingent upon interspecies communication, relations, and transformations. And the Anti-Use Umbrella then argues that an exploitative and repressive civilization can ostensibly be jolted out of its habitual violence by tales fraught with the marvelous. If humans are to stop exploiting animals, they need to relearn how to imagine human-animal relations in ways that are egalitarian and enchanted, and to see animals as active and creative, endowed with their own remarkable qualities. The first edition of the leaflet was bordered with drawings of animals, both actual and imaginary, by Leonora Carrington, while the second edition from 1989 was adorned with similar imagery by Gina Litherland, who had joined the group a few years earlier. And that's the version seen here in Regrettably Poor Resolution. Both artists' drawings emphasize that surrealism's appeal to the marvelous is also, on the one hand, a call to break out of the strict divisions between species imposed by modern taxonomy and philosophy, and on the other, to cultivate a new form of vision that is able to apprehend the desire and enchantment animating the natural world. The belief in the imagination of the marvelous as means of transforming human-animal relations also indicates much of the specifically surrealist dimension of this prescient plea for animal rights. Through the workings of the surrealist imagination, animals again become fellow travelers with humanity. And the group would place ever more emphasis on ecological concerns in the years to come. And these took shape through a typically surrealist construction of a traditional poetic environmental awareness, as well as through an acute attention to contemporary issues and developments. As the introduction to the collection of tracts The Forecast is Hot relates, the group sought inspiration in a range of American precursors, and they found elective environmental affinities in the writings of, for instance, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, and perhaps in particular David Bellamy and John Muir. In the early 1980s, the environmental movement gained further fame and infamy. Its environmental questions rose to prominence on the international political agenda, and environmental activists pressed on for more drastic measures in the protection of nature against human exploitation. Members of the Chicago group were attracted to radical environmental activist Earth First, with whom they shared a fundamental anarchist bent, as well as a belief in the necessity to not just protect, but to actively expand wilderness. In the article The Surrealist Adventure and the Poetry of Direct Action, Ron Sokolsky describes its relations and relates how the Surrealist group co-founded the Chicago chapter of Earth First in the mid-1980s. The group's 1980s publications show tangible traces of their combined participation in ecological activism and continued interrogation of the specifically surrealist conditions of ecology. The Chicago group, for example, disseminated their views of surrealism's ecological dimensions through international collaborations. In 1986, the group produced the first issue of a new international surrealist bulletin together with the then newly founded Surrealist Group of Stockholm. This international surrealist bulletin was meant to function as an organ of communication for the many contemporary international surrealist groups that flourished. And one of the Chicago group's contributions is Gino Litherland and Hal Ramble's brief declaration, An Unjust Dominion, which draws its title from the ever-present L'Autre-Amont. Litherland and Ramble discuss the problem of speciesism, which they assert needs to be given the same attention as the related problems of racism, sexism, capitalism, and statism. As long as humans willfully destroy the earth and kill and torture animals in laboratories and slaughterhouses, future human existence is meaningless, they claim. The track's sentiment is familiar from animal rights and deep ecology, for instance, but its final paragraph takes things in a slightly different direction, as it proclaims that the poetry made by all must include the choruses of cicadas, crows, narwhals, timber wolves, okapi, and another 21 very specifically defined species of very different kinds. So animals do not merely need to be liberated, they need to be invited into the poetic community. A further reconciliation of environmental concerns and what may be called surrealist nature philosophy occurs in Litherland's Imagination in Wilderness 3 years later. Protesting the oppression of women, indigenous people, and animals by patriarchal and Eurocentric forces, Litherland also ascribes privileged knowledge to the non-human world. Quote, wilderness overflows with animals, plants, stones, and trees that are dreaming of vast utopias unknown to any of us, end quote. And humans, for Litherland, can tap into this knowledge by approaching poetry in new ways, and so break the spell of coercive utilitarianism, and again participate in the world of wilderness and rekindle old as well as forge new patterns of solidarity and coexistence. A reproduction of one of Litherland's own paintings next to the essay shows a levitating Red Riding Hood hold the hand of a wolf in a forest clearing inhabited by animals and mythological beings. Darkly alluring and tinged with wild eroticism, the painting indicates the subversive possibilities of interspecies relations. There are parallels between Litherland's contentions that liberated animals will produce surrealist poetry and that wilderness dreams and imagines, with some surprisingly little remark upon passages in Breton's writings. In his 1933 Minotaur essay, Picasso in His Element, Breton compares the act of surrealist painting with a spider's spinning of its web. Both acts, he writes, are excretions, desperate and creative acts of attempting to transform the external world. And in his 1955 Medium essay, Surrealism in its Living Works, Breton states that surrealism has always adhered to the view of animals and nature expressed by the French poet Gerard de Nerval in his sonnet Verdurer. And in it, Nerval questions humanity's self-delusion that it is the only thinking species, when in fact the entire universe thinks. he conjures up a panpsychist view of the world in which metal loves, flowers think, and the rough surfaces of stones hide growing souls. Litherland and Ramble draw upon these long-standing pan-creative and pan-psychist tendencies in surrealism to drastically question anthropocentric notions that posit humanity to be the sole possessor of creative imagination and thinking. And Imagination in Wilderness was published in the 4th issue of the Chicago group's journal Arsenal Surrealist Version from 1989, from which I quoted an editorial at the start of my paper. The issue features a plethora of texts and imagery related to ecology, animals, and nature, which indicate the pluralistic character of the group's approach to ecology. And these include essays by Breton and Carrington, alongside Christopher Starr writing on entomology and memorably proclaiming, like dreaming in poetry, bug watching must be done by all. And Penelope Rosemont's The Golden Goose, which probes the fairy tale for intuitions about new relations between species. Environmental activism is also notably present. A series of brief editorial statements bring attention to particularly pressing issues for animals and the environment, most of them related to Earth First, with titles such as Let There Be Wolves, No Jail for Whales, and Hands Off Antarctica. These call attention to the need to keep human and corporate hands off animals and the environment. Another short note, why not try monkey wrenching? Discusses Earth First co-founder Dave Foreman and Bill Haywood's Eco-Defense, a guide to so-called ecotage or ecological sabotage. So in this issue, specifically surrealist perspectives on ecology of a often very speculative kind combine effortlessly with direct environmental concerns, and the latter are frequently ascribed a certain inherent surrealist poetry. The Chicago group's fervent promotion of radical environmentalism struck a chord with other surrealists. For one, the lifelong defender of animals, Leonora Carrington, befriended the group during her stay in Chicago during the late 1980s and early 90s. And as Sokolsky describes, she was an ardent supporter of Earth First in its drive to expand wilderness and take back nature from the highways and malls that have replaced it with asphalt and human architecture. And other surrealists, notably in Madrid, Prague, and Stockholm, have asserted the need for surrealism to intervene in the ecological crisis. While I have to leave a regrettable amount of other notable aspects of the Chicago surrealist ecology unexamined for now, I want to note that the ecological concerns have far from diminished in the almost 3 decades that have followed upon the last issue of Arsenal. From celebrations of the upheaval caused by the Great Flood in Chicago in '92, over 2009's protest against NASA plans for experimental bombings of the moon, to tract about the Mexican Gulf oil disaster of 2010. The Chicago group has kept their sight on the oppression of the natural world and emphasized the connection between it and the suppression of imagination and the marvelous, so extending and radicalizing surrealism's ecological disposition. Thank you.